Speaking of central government and central bankers, should the government play a role in setting monetary conditions? And if so, how much? A new paper out of the U.S. Federal Reserve finds that while some kinds of economic intervention can help consumers, others, not so much. Joining us from Ottawa with more on these findings is Ian Lee. He's an economist and professor at the Sprott School of Business. Ian, were any of the findings from this study a surprise to you?
Some of them were. Some of them were not a surprise to me, but will probably be a surprise to many others. I want to just step back. What these three authors did, one of them is at the Brookings Institute, and he has written a lot of papers on macroeconomic intervention and macroprudential policymaking. And he has the unusual ability as an economist to write in clear English as opposed to baffle-gab and mumbo-jumbo. And so I really do applaud this paper, because what they did is they looked back over the last 80 years, really since the Depression until now, in the United States, and it's really a history and analysis of central bank intervention to try to regulate things like asset bubbles, inflation, and so forth. And what they did was they divided, and it was very clever, I thought, they divided all of they created a classification system, which is very useful. They divided all of these interventions in the past into two types: those that regulate the demand for credit. Think of mortgage underwriting rules that you and I have talked about, such as limiting the amortization or the down payment requirements. That is on the demand side of credit. And then the more traditional central bank intervention on the supply side, so reserve ratios and that sort of thing. And what they found, although they were speaking very delicately, because two of these authors are at the Federal Reserve, was that I think what they were saying somewhat in code was that regulation of the demand side of credit is more effective than the traditional central bank monetary intervention on the supply side of credit. And so why I was so intrigued is that feeds into my belief that government has a very important role to play in regulating the maximum amortization and regulating the minimum down payment. Because as we've seen, I think Flaherty understood this, and the papers almost suggest that Flaherty's interventions on the demand side have been more effective in Canada than Bernanke's interventions on the supply side in the U.S.
Oh, this is very interesting. So you're making a difference between what a finance minister can do versus a central banker. The central banker controls the supply side, the looseness of money, interest rates, those kinds of things.
Yes.
It's the fiscal policy that you say is more powerful.
Indeed. In fact, I was a little bit surprised, now coming back to your previous question, I was a little bit surprised that they classified the regulation of the demand side for credit as a macroprudential monetary policy. I would have thought, this is probably debating how many angels can sit on the head of a pin, but I thought that that was probably fiscal policy under the purview or the authority of the Minister of Finance or the Treasury Secretary in the United States. But the point is, setting aside those sort of semantic distinctions, regulating credit standards is as every mortgage lender in this country will tell you right now, is actually very, very effective. You can really bring overheated real estate market to a halt really quickly by, e.g., increasing the down payment from 5% to 8%, or bringing back the amortization from 35 to 30 to 25. Things like that really bite into the market almost instantly.
Okay, let's go back a little bit of a history lesson then. If these guys are looking at this policy, you know, the United States has had a policy in place for a long time that every American should own their own home, but it meant taking out a mortgage and so on. So was that the impetus for the bubble we saw in 2008 and in housing prices, for instance, or was it the low interest rates on the supply side of things that was the driver?
Pat, you've just asked what I think is the single most important question about the 2008 crisis, which has been debated unbelievably so since then. In fact, entire forests of trees have been cut down to print the debates of the people on both sides. The one side says, you know, Greenspan kept interest rates too low and that fueled the bubble. And then there's others, and I'm one of them, who argued that the watering down of the mortgage underwriting rules that occurred in the 1990s in the House and Senate of of the Congress. Senator Dodd was chair of the Banking Committee in the 90s from the Democratic Party, and the House of Reps representative from Boston, I'm sorry, his name escapes me for a moment, even though I know his name well, was on the other side. And what they did was they argued that rigorous mortgage underwriting standards were discriminatory towards poor people, which I always thought was a fatuous comment, because any standard that imposes minimum standards of down payment and income are going to, by definition, be discriminatory towards those who can't meet those standards. Nonetheless, they watered down those standards to the point that they went to zero down payment and the so-called subprime mortgage lending that created first the housing bubble, I and others have argued, followed by the housing collapse when those low-income people realized they could not afford their house and walked away and abandoned their house. And then that caused the housing collapse, and that in turn triggered, I argue and others have argued, the financial crisis. And if they had properly regulated the mortgage underwriting rules in a much more prudential manner, as we did in Canada, I argue and others argue, they would not have had the housing bubble, housing meltdown, followed by the financial crisis.
Wow, this is counterintuitive for capitalism, Ian, because what you're suggesting is more regulation is better. I mean, we didn't have the banking crisis in Canada because our banks are more regulated, our mortgages are more regulated. More regulation is better for the economy?
You just put your finger on it. There's a real paradox here. In fact, they document that in the Second World War and then right after the Second World War and into the Korean War, the Federal Reserve actually did regulate underwriting standards. It was called Regulation W, and there was a big pushback from the Republican Party at the time, saying this is going to lead to state central control of the economy through credit. And as somebody who is a fiscal conservative and a very pro-market person, I understand the risk. Having said that, this only emphasizes the need for very prudential management of these standards, which is probably why politicians should not be regulating the mortgage underwriting rules, notwithstanding that Florida did a good job. Maybe that was just an exception to the norm. The U.S., when they intervened politically, they really botched it badly, and perhaps the central bank should be responsible, as the Fed once was in the 40s and early 50s before Congress repealed Regulation W and took that authority back and gave it to the Congress. Maybe there is an argument for the central bank to be prudentially regulating the demand for credit through such things as stockbroker margin requirements and, of course, mortgage underwriting rules.
Yeah. Oh, Ian, we could go on at length. There's no securities right here.
Yeah, you are a capitalist.
I figured that one out, Ian. Ian, great to chat. Thank you very much for bringing this study to our attention.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Ian Lee, economist, professor at the Sprott School of Business in Ottawa. Still.